the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian. Good morning, everyone. I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction because I think the most important thing when you have such a distinguished panel here available and such urgent issues at hand is to invite my panel to join over here. I'd like you to give each of them a very warm welcome, starting with our keynote speaker, Ms. Navi Pillay. Fatih Bensouda, of course, whom you heard last night at the reception giving our keynote address. Richard Dicker of Human Rights Watch. Ms. Tina Antelman, the current president of the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court. Dr. Ernest Petric, the president of the Constitutional Court of Slovenia. And Stephen Rapp, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes. And last but not least, Christian Wellenweser, who is the previous president of the Assembly of States Parties of the ICC. On, yes. In order to get started, may I invite you, Ms. Pillay, to give the keynote address, please. While she walks over there, I've been instructed to keep time very strictly, so I'm going to try to do that. And I would like to also draw your attention, especially since we have the younger generation here, that there is a lot of tweeting going on, and please use the hashtag BLED13, and then we can make sure it's retweeted as well. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. So bear with me as I read a keynote speech, because that sets the pace of the discussion, and I look forward to joining the panel as well. Let me say how delighted I am to be with you this morning to discuss how justice can help ensure a prosperous future for all, including women and children. Justice is essential to a future in which all people can live in dignity and full enjoyment of their human rights. This is what I and my office stand for. Allow me then to focus on three things: the role of international criminal justice in efforts to ensure accountability, to the pursuit of accountability for crimes of sexual violence, and thirdly, the importance of prevention. Now, the role of international criminal justice. Justice is a cornerstone of accountability. My years of experience as a lawyer and judge in South Africa, as a judge on the Rwanda Tribunal and then the International Criminal Court, and now as High Commissioner for Human Rights, have shown me again and again that failure to secure accountability for victims of human rights violations does critical harm to the victims and to society at large. This is especially true with violations that amount to international crimes, given they are often committed on a large scale and are especially egregious. Through many avenues of international and national levels, the pursuit of accountability aims at four things. One, holding individuals and entities responsible for past crimes. Two, ensuring remedies for victims. Three, avoiding future repetitions of violations. And four, enforcing the law. Ensuring accountability underpins the concept and practice of transitional justice, which relies upon the interlinked mechanisms of prosecution, truth-seeking, reparations, and institutional reform to address the legacy of past violations and restore the victim's sense of justice and dignity. Conversely, failure to ensure accountability further violates the rights of victims. Failure creates or contributes to to a climate of impunity that undermines the rule of law. In post-conflict environments, the lack of accountability can undermine any process for reconciliation and state building. Moreover, the cry for accountability is irrepressible. Around the world, we see that the determined search for accountability for human rights violations, though often already decades old, ultimately bears fruit. Prosecutions have advanced in Colombia and in Argentina after the amnesties in place in those countries were declared unconstitutional by the courts. Former presidents have been put on trial in Uruguay and Guatemala, though in the latter case the trial against Rios Montt remains on hold. Elsewhere, the International Court of Justice has ruled that Senegal must begin proceedings against former Chadian leader Hissène Habré without delay. In February this year, the Extraordinary African Chambers opened in Senegal to try him. In Cambodia, the Extraordinary Chambers have also now conducted trials of alleged perpetrators of international crimes that were committed over 45 years ago. But sadly, impunity remains prevalent across the world, endangering a shift from a culture of impunity to one of accountability is the core aim of the work of my office. It is also a process to which the ever-strengthening framework of international criminal justice has made a substantial contribution. The growth of a system of international criminal justice has been remarkable in my view. In a relatively short space of time, it has evolved from vision into reality, culminating in the Rome Statute that in 1998 established the International Criminal Court. While the ICC's importance at the international level is now self-evident, I am particularly interested in its effect at national level. One of the noteworthy features of the Rome Statute system is its emphasis, notably through the complementarity principle, on the responsibility of states to deliver justice. In this way, the ICC can be a catalyst for achieving, through domestic mechanisms, greater accountability for serious human rights violations. Vitally important in itself, the growth of strong accountability efforts at the national level holds the promise of significantly reinforcing our efforts at the global level to combat impunity for all human rights violations. Now, let me move now to accountability for crimes of sexual violence. Just as the framework of international criminal justice has developed, so have the accompanying legal norms and concepts. This has had significant positive consequences for accountability. For instance, in advancing recognition of the violence suffered by women and girls. The jurisprudence of international courts and tribunals has played an immensely important role in achieving recognition of the pronounced tendency of conflict to exacerbate existing patterns of gender discrimination, resulting in women and girls being at risk of all forms of violence and disproportionately sexual violence. For instance, in the Akiesu judgment of 1998, the ICTR found that the massive and systematic rape of Tutsi women in Rwanda was carried out with the intention of destroying the Tutsi group as a whole, and thus amounted to the crime of genocide. But despite these advances, accountability remains elusive for far too many women and girl victims. The explicit inclusion in the Rome Statute of sexual and gender-based crimes offers the opportunity for greater numbers of victims of these crimes to see justice. The prosecutor of the ICC has made clear her strong commitment to tackling impunity for gender-based violence. I have warmly applauded her on other occasions, and I do so again today. Accountability, however, requires more than prosecutions alone. Victims of sexual violence too often are left to bear the adverse effects of the harm they have suffered. Medical, social, psychological, and material support is essential to enable them to deal with the consequences of such harm. Reparations of this kind contribute to confronting and overcoming the structural conditions that led to the violence, including often deeply ingrained gender discrimination and disempowerment, and may also help prevent the recurrence of violence. Participation by women and girl victims in international criminal proceedings may in and of itself serve as a form of reparation. If adequate protection measures are taken to avoid re-victimization and exposure to further harm, the process of seeking justice and of accountability can be empowering for female victims and may thus contribute to their recovery. Now to the importance of prevention. As international criminal justice necessarily looks to the past, there is a corresponding need to look to the future. Indeed, a just world entails preventing violations from happening in the first place. This is a message constantly brought home to us by young people everywhere who are standing up and taking to the streets to demonstrate that respect for the rule of law and human rights is essential to ensuring that the future is better than the past and better than the present. Prevention demands from us our awareness and our decisive response to early warning indicators. Human rights monitoring, documentation, analysis, and reporting are vital aspects of our daily work of my office. These preventive measures that we take serve to highlight emerging human rights situations and help us make recommendations for action. Fact-finding missions and international commissions of inquiry, such as those my office independently conducts or those we support, for instance on the Syrian Arab Republic and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, play a significant role in this regard. Public incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence is one important early warning indicator. While a judge at the ICTR, I saw the extent to which virulent and hate-laden propaganda can incite extreme violence. As a result of the propaganda that was delivered through the radio and the print media, the three accused in the ICTR media case, I'm very pleased to see Stephen Rapp here, who was the prosecutor who successfully concluded that case. Well, they were convicted of genocide, direct and public incitement to genocide, and conspiracy to commit genocide, as well as extermination and persecution as crimes against humanity, as a result of the propaganda they delivered through the radio and print media. The ICTR also said that sexually explicit cartoons may have contributed to the rapes that occurred. It is absolutely critical to act in the face of such incitement. The early warning signs cannot be ignored. While upholding freedom of expression, incitement to violence must be denounced. All acts of violence must be prosecuted, including incitement to such acts and advocacy of hatred that amounts to incitement. I refer you to the Rabat Plan of Action on the prohibition of advocacy of hatred constituting incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, which was launched in February this year. This plan of action offers useful guidance on how to better confront and deal with this complex and controversial issue. Prevention also implies that we creatively confront emerging challenges, of which there are many. For example, effectively countering new forms of terrorism, while ensuring respect for human rights may not be easy, but it is essential. Explosive weapons is another issue here. Particularly when used in populated areas, they have a devastating long-term impact on the lives and fundamental rights of civilian populations who are already bearing the brunt of conflict. Their use in populated areas must be addressed. I know that the moderator is very keen to touch on the subject of the one conflict that seems to defy any solution, that is Syria, and this is where one of the concerns is the use of these very harmful weapons. Now, furthermore, while celebrating the advantages of the Internet, including for freedom of opinion and expression, we cannot be blind to the risks posed by the use of the Internet. Therefore, surveillance, cybercrime, cyber warfare, and cyber stalking all raise significant human rights concerns. Ensuring strong legal protection that keeps pace with emerging trends is an essential part of addressing such challenges. We face daunting challenges. Today, Syria is spiraling into deeper and deeper horror and violence. The march towards democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law in Egypt is faltering. Conflict overwhelms the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In these countries and in others, action to prevent ever more frequent violations of fundamental human rights is imperative. At the same time, the palpable need for accountability must be met. A just future for the world demands no less. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blay, for this whirlwind overview of the past and future, prevention, prosecution. I think everything was in there. And since you referred to Dr. Bensouda, prosecutor of the ICC, especially on this point of women and children, can I proceed by giving you the floor?
I just, at the risk of losing...
Can you press the button? Because the red light is on this.
Thank you. At the risk of losing some valuable time for this brief introductory remarks, I just want to start by extending a warm thank you to our Slovenian host, and also to say that it's a privilege for me to be part of this eminent panel. I think Her Excellency, the High Commissioner, has set the tone for this discussion. Because over the years, the world has witnessed large-scale violence, brutality, gross human rights abuses. And in all of this, we see that women and children are the ones who bear the brunt of the atrocities. And the lack of justice and accountability for the perpetrators has emboldened others, but also has, they continue to wage war, in the course of which the crimes of rape and crimes against children continue to be committed and has become accepted, unfortunately, as the norm. And this has been a major factor, I believe, in hindering women's capacity to promote long-term social changes through their ability to influence future generations. And as we speak today, violence and destruction continue to ravage some parts of the world, including, as was mentioned by Her Excellency, the Great Lakes region of Africa. And in the same way that there can be no peace without justice, we also need to realize that there is a very close relationship between justice, human development, and poverty, as well as education. And we cannot overemphasize the economic benefits of a lasting peace, peace that is based on economic development, the so-called peace dividend. And my belief, and I believe shared by many, in particular women, is that women represent the best hope for building lasting peace. It is women who hold communities together and who bring up their children when men take up arms in times of war. And there can be no doubt that women are stronger and better equipped to play a key role in securing peace. The question is, how do we leverage this asset? As a prosecutor of the First Permanent International Criminal Court, my job is to reverse the increasing tide of disproportionate impact that conflicts have on women and children, and to do this by relentlessly pursuing those most responsible for committing these crimes against them. By punishing the perpetrators, we hope to deter future commission of these crimes. And our hope really is to free women's voices, not only as victims of these crimes, but more importantly, as participants in peace talks. The future that we all yearn is that we will be only able to realize that if women are freed from fears of war, enabling them to take full responsibility for peace, for security, and for development. And realizing also, and I believe this has also been mentioned by Her Excellency, the lack of access to justice is one of the defining attributes of poverty and is an impediment to poverty eradication. The policy of my office that we have taken of encouraging and supporting national judicial efforts to investigate and also prosecute is key, I think, to bringing peace. We believe that empowering women and also empowering children as engines of economic growth will help to improve the productivity, but will also help to develop outcomes for the whole next generation, in particular in the central parts of Africa, where we have seen over the years the entire lives of communities have been disrupted, and this is due mainly to crimes against women and crimes against children. So we need to unlock the potential of women to be the true agents of change by allowing them to play their fundamental role in society, not only at the political level, but also at the corporate level, and also at the academic leadership level. And in order to succeed, I believe our work as the Office of the Prosecutor needs to be underscored and incorporated by others in the Rome Statute system. Notably, it needs to be incorporated by states parties who have the primary role of investigating and prosecuting these crimes. So we will do our part to contribute to strengthening societies. We will do it by addressing and therewith deterring the massive crimes that for so long has plagued our communities, our countries. It has threatened peace. It has prevented, especially, sustainable development for these affected communities. And as such, and this will be my conclusion, one can safely say that the International Criminal Court, with its limited budget and in representing millions of victims of unimaginable atrocities around the globe, should be seen as a relatively inexpensive investment in the future of women and humanity as a whole. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think that's a clear message to all those budget-cutting, austerity finance ministers around the world saying, can't we cut those international organizations a little bit? But we'll get back to that. I'm going to turn to Richard Dicker, because when we were preparing the panel, we were trying to think if we could come up with some contrary examples where the rule of law, or the absence of the rule of law, actually did not seem to be an impediment to growth. We came up with Pinochet. I think if we look at Russia and China today, those could be interesting examples. So could you please take the floor on this point?
Yeah. I want to start by thanking the organizers for including this very timely topic in the conversation here at BLED and inviting me to join this very distinguished panel. My focus is going to be picking up on two themes. one that the High Commissioner mentioned, and another that the prosecutor just mentioned. And it all has to do with the debate between justice and peace and justice and economic development, a debate which has intensified as the possibility for bringing leaders who commit serious human rights violations to justice has increased. And with international courts and national courts over the last decades bringing cases against senior officials, the landscape for justice has indeed shifted. Let me get into the first of my two scenarios, justice and peace negotiations. Certainly, in bringing an end to armed conflict, too many mediators see the possibility of trial as a deal breaker in fragile peace talks. They argue that suspects bearing responsibility for atrocities have no interest in laying down their arms unless they know in advance that they can avoid criminal charges. I believe it's important to look closely at this strand of conventional wisdom, and we've done serious research. I brought some copies of our essential report with me and glad to give it to anyone interested on this interface between justice and peace negotiation. The reality that we found is that criminal charges against abusive leaders and the resulting stigmatization can marginalize suspected war criminals and may contribute to future stability. The experience of the Dayton negotiations and the sidelining of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic is only one example of that. On the other hand, foregoing accountability, as the High Commissioner said, can often carry a high price. It can create fertile ground for those who seek to manipulate history, and as we've seen in this region, and you know better than I, so tragically 20 years ago, assumptions of collective guilt rooted in atrocities dating back to the Second World War was an important factor in enabling ultranationalist politicians to divide ethnic communities. Where tension does exist, and I'm not arguing that it does not, between justice and peace in negotiations to end conflict, that tension needs to be smartly managed rather than simply subordinating justice to some point in the far-off future. The second scenario I want to speak to that our moderator mentioned is in particular justice and economic development, where there is a view that trials of the most serious crimes pose obstacles to economic development. And this is coming increasingly from the international development community, donor states and international aid agencies, and arises in connection with rule of law support for national trials of these most serious crimes. Not surprisingly, national trials face real challenges in terms of overcoming capacity gaps and infrastructure shortages. But often, more tellingly, leaders implicated in crimes alleged are glad to see the losers prosecuted, but there's no interest in prosecuting some of their own. And we've seen in the development community this argument that because trials of these kinds of most sensitive or serious crimes are so sensitive, it can jeopardize other important development projects and thereby retard economic development. This strain of thought, I believe, bears careful scrutiny also, and I would argue that rather than a rigid a priori view that accountability retards economic development, more often than not, impunity for these crimes holds back meaningful economic growth because of its symbiotic relationship with the lack of good governance and corruption. And I'm not arguing that this is the case in every single country all the time. As mentioned, Chile under Pinochet and China after the Tiananmen Square massacres are important counter examples. But rather than cementing justice and economic growth in a dogmatic and, I believe, false opposition, the reality is that impunity is associated with unstable development because it goes hand in hand with weak rule of law, corruption, and impunity for economic crimes. And these are powerful obstacles to economic growth. Importantly, the World Bank report of 2011 on world development, I think, echoes these themes in an important way. In conclusion, I think there's a need for a more innovative, creative approach consistent with development in international law in understanding and managing peace, justice, and economic growth. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Dicker. I would like to turn next to Tina Entelman, the president of the Assembly of States Parties of the ICC. You travel and you work tirelessly for support for the ICC, and especially in new ratifications. And I'd be interested also to know if this economic theme is one that is recurrent in your work, that you get questioned about. And of course, I think we all know about the difficult budget discussions there are every year surrounding the ICC. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank also the organizers for allocating time for this very important topic. Well, we were asked to speak about the linkages of economic development and international criminal justice. I remember from the United Nations that there are quite emotional discussions at times about rights that people should enjoy. And in the framework of these discussions, some argue that economic rights, or as they put it, the right to development, takes precedence. And only once we have established some kind of economic well-being could we speak about civil rights and political rights. And coming closer to the work of the ICC, we should remember in the situations in which the ICC works, and these are mostly the situations where the conflict is still ongoing or the country has just come out of the conflict. And there, of course, people who are seized with establishing peace often say that first peace should come and then we see about justice. And these are just the two very few examples, two examples about how difficult the discussion about international criminal justice still is, and how there are attempts to put in question first the timing and sometimes even the scope of pursuing justice. While preparing for this panel, I was also asked to mention our own experience. I'm a person who was born and raised behind the Iron Curtain, and of course now in this position, how do I see justice and the pursuit of justice? I must say that for us it was not of primary importance to pursue justice, we rather engaged in very complicated modalities of establishing truth about what had happened, and looking ahead, seeing how we could go ahead. But what was very, very important in this discussion, and what has also become increasingly important at the United Nations in the discussions among all states that belong to the United Nations, is rule of law at national and international levels. And this is something that creates a sustainable basis for economic development. And we have seen it in our case also, and countries who have also emerged from behind the Iron Curtain, I think can also say that rule of law is very important. And last year, the United Nations negotiated a high-level declaration about the rule of law, and there also the importance of justice and the importance of the work that the ICC is doing is very clearly highlighted. I should also maybe mention the victims. Like Fatou Bensouda said that women suffer a lot in these conflicts, and of course the facts, if you look at really what is happening, it's gruesome. And I happened to read the memoirs of former High Commissioner Mary Robinson just recently, and she writes how difficult it was for her to see wide-scale impunity. But she also writes, "I had nothing tangible to offer victims. They needed our action and not our tears." And I think that with the ICC, now we have something to offer. We have the Trust Fund for Victims that has reached out to more than 100,000 people, and they are not only compensating concrete people, they also reach out to communities. And I really believe that this also helps the communities to reclaim the sense of security, and also translates into some kind of basis for economic development. The issue of complementarity and the obligation of states to create a possibility to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes at home was mentioned by all previous speakers. We are dedicating a lot of time to this issue, but it is very, very complicated. It's not only about the concrete investigations when crimes have happened. It's in general, even the discussion about creating this ability, putting these crimes in domestic legislation, and creating this ability to investigate that is politically so sensitive that at times we even cannot talk about it. And this is alarming. It is really alarming. We are trying to promote this issue since Kampala. It has been very much on the agenda, but we do not really have a major success to report. So in conclusion, I would say that it is not maybe easy to establish a direct linkage between international criminal justice and economic development. For instance, it would probably be very difficult to go to the leaders of Central African Republic and say that you will see immediate economic development in your country if you cooperate with the ICC. It doesn't go like that. But if you put this discussion in the framework of rule of law, the linkages are very direct. And we are constantly looking for countries who could join us in public awareness campaigns explaining the value of international criminal justice. And Slovenia, of course, has seen very closely the developments in the Western Balkans, and could be a very good advocate for the rule of law, linkages of the rule of law and international criminal justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that's a beautiful way to switch to our only Slovenian on the panel, Dr. Petric. And I think people would be interested not only from your perspective as President of the Constitutional Court, but also precisely from this regional perspective, having witnessed the tremendous change here in the region and the different ways that the countries have dealt with these questions of accountability for previous crimes. The floor is yours. Oh, and please do that all in 3 minutes.
Pardon?
And please do that all in 3 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here under your leadership and in this fantastic company and dealing with a problem which is of extreme importance for our times, but even more for the future of the future generations, grandchildren, who wish to live in peace, security, and justice. And as some predecessors said, when I was thinking of this topic today, it was a little bit difficult to establish the link, direct linkage between international criminal jurisdiction and economic development. It is easier to establish this linkage between the rule of law, or German Rechtsstaat, and economic development. Because yes, in a society with the rule of law, people are safe, they are ready to invest, they are ready to work, they are creative, they develop their creative capabilities and so on. Although even in these cases, we have seen some situations like Chile was mentioned, and China was mentioned, and I could mention the German Reich. Tremendous economic development, but gross violations of human rights and no rule of law and so on. So even these relations, one should be a little bit cautious. But yes, empirical research proves it, common wisdom proves it, that the rule of law is beneficial for economic development. But when I was thinking the linkage between rule of law and international criminal jurisdiction and economic development, the predecessor spoke about that, and I agree with it. And it is not so simple, this linkage, if we have in mind economic development only as such. But if we have in mind life in a society where development is understood as a society in which people live happy, creatively, feel that they live within the system of justice and so on, then of course this linkage is there. This linkage is there, and no matter economic development, if in a society, even economic development is there, but no respect for human rights, the rulers are criminals, maybe prosecuted, but not delivered to the ICC and so on, there will be no positive atmosphere in the society, and finally also development. The pure, single-minded economic development will be harmed. That's the first thing which I wanted to say. Then, of course, here we have such excellent and such honorable representatives of the ICC and international criminal justice. So I dare to say two, three words on that. You know, the ICC is to me a historic achievement. If Stefan Zweig would be still living, probably in his book, Moments of Stars, he would maybe include it also the establishment of this court. The historic breakthrough was in '48 with the Declaration on Human Rights. The international community finally realized that human rights are so important for peace, for international communities and all, after the experience of the Second World War and all the totalitarian regimes. The next step of such historic importance is ICC. We have it now. Unfortunately, it's not universal yet. Unfortunately, there are serious problems. I'm a little bit involved in that. And we should really take care to keep this precious institution, which should have such an importance for the future, in the process that nobody should remain unpunished for after committing the worst, the most heinous crimes. That is something which should be really have in mind and not play simply enough money, too little money, this and that. It is a common responsibility on all of us, and I'm speaking here to a lot of young people. It is something which is, so to say, crucial for the future. It plays the role not only by prosecuting people, it plays also a role as an example to national jurisdiction, to constitutional courts, to other courts. It is sending all the time a message. And here I also make a footnote. This message should be really very, very thought through. Because messages like some acquittals lately by ICTY, I don't know if they are the right messages, because in countries in the Balkans, and here I'm coming to you, there are 800, more than 800 cases open at courts. And if some gentlemen, whose names I will not mention here, but we know whom I mean, are acquitted, can you imagine what message it is to judges in Republika Srpska, for instance, to prosecute some Serb for some crimes against women? There, after acquittal of such stars, quote unquote, of the terrible developments in the Balkans in the past. Let me also say that we should consider ICC so important that we should really send there the best people which will establish, confirm the authority of this court. People sent there as judges should not be rewarded for that. It is the most hard work, the most responsible work there. Physically difficult to run the cases, to have the hearings and so on. The best judges, criminal judges we have, we should send there. Maybe some diplomat here and there. I'm a diplomat, of course. But I don't think there is a place for diplomats there. And first of all, it is not a place for people to be rewarded. No, it is a place to devoted people to do this very, very important hard work. We see lately, and maybe by that then I will conclude, we see lately some criticism concerning the ICC. We should be very cautious about that. There are the ideas of some regional similar courts. There are pluses and minuses in this process. We should be very cautious. But if we want the court to be really authoritative, then, of course, also its work should be the highest possible level. There should be no flaws. There should be no little mistakes. The last, if I may say, Madam, when I'm looking at these developments as a judge and before as a professor and so on, you know, we have a vast space. Besides, yes, with good reason, you have, Madam, put such a stress to the crimes against women and the role of women and so on. I fully agree with you. But the human rights have been established as a reaction to the violations of states, totalitarian regimes, the powerful state, and people should be granted their human rights against the state. But state, according to my understanding, is in a way weaker and weaker. We have civil societies which we didn't have 50, 60 years ago. We have one world, democratic world, mainly with some exceptions. We have free press around the world. We have checks and balances in states and so on. State is still a danger for human rights. Of course, we have, every year our constitutional court, we have close to 2,000 cases where people complain that their rights, human rights, have been violated by the state. But there is another danger on the horizon, the organized crime. Organized crime which is attacking human rights all around the world, including human trafficking, corruption, crimes of the so-called white collars. And here we are still rather weak. And I think the international community should in the future start to pay more attention also to this huge, growing crime, which is directly and indirectly threatening human rights. Anyhow, Madam, I hope I wasn't too long. If I was, I excuse myself to everyone. Thank you very much.
I think it was fascinating enough. Thank you. Ambassador Rapp, before I hand the floor over to you, I want to give you a personal compliment because I mean, we all know that the US under the Obama administration has made an incredible transition in support to the International Criminal Court. And having experienced this firsthand when I was working for the ICC, I want to also testify that Ambassador Rapp himself has played a very important role in that. And the fact that we are now working together, that the ICC sees America as an ally in many ways, I don't know when and if the US would ever sign up to the Rome Statute, but that's not the point. The point is that I think that if you can cooperate because you have the same goals in many parts of the world, that's extremely important. So I really commend you for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment, and the efforts continue, and we'll have an opportunity, I hope, in a bit to talk about the Syria situation and some others. And I want to thank the organizers for this panel and for including me. I'd like to focus for a bit on some of the situations that I've dealt with. I was a prosecutor in Africa for 8.5 years, the first 2/3 of the Rwanda Tribunal, and then chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And then in the last 4 years, the envoy as the ambassador at large for global justice for President Obama, dealing with, frankly, more than 20 of these situations, past and present. And one, often in front of a variety of audiences, has to deal with this issue of the relationship between international justice and economic development, and challenges are presented and arguments are presented. But I always cite to them, first and foremost, my own experience in Sierra Leone, where a special court was established, an internationalized court. It will complete its work in about 3 weeks on September 26th when it renders the final appeals judgment in the case of Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, an historic case with a judgment due on September 26th. And that court has gone on longer than initially anticipated. It's cost more than people had thought. It's going to come up to close to about $250 million U.S., almost all raised by voluntary contributions. And it's been focused on only the highest level, like the ICC. We've indicted and pursued the case of 13 persons at the same time that there was a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And occasionally people would say, wouldn't that money have been better used in this very poor country on economic development? But when you talk to the victims, you don't hear that. Now, of course, the victims are concerned about their own injuries and desire for reparations, and we have a small reparations program, but not enough. But they talk about the fact that at the time of this conflict, rebels and there was really a two-sided conflict, but people could come into your community and burn your house and loot your shop and chop off your hands, rape your wife, kidnap your daughter and turn her into a sex slave, one child off to dig diamonds and perhaps to die of starvation, digging diamonds for the rebels, another to become a child soldier, to be brutalized and victimized. And when that kind of situation exists, it's impossible to build anything because nothing stands. And it's only when you can end that kind of victimization that society has a chance. Sierra Leone during the conflict had, I think on the UN development list, it was 189 out of 190. Only Somalia was lower. But since these prosecutions have taken place and the conflict has come to an end, the country's had 3 peaceful elections, including one in which the opposition won and was allowed to take power, and none of them have had lethal violence. And I've had people, even I was a woman who was an editor of a newspaper who was an extreme critic of the court, was in Washington a couple weeks ago at a forum, and she stood up and said she'd been a critic, but now she saw that this had really made it possible for the country to turn the corner. And it's moved up now from the bottom 10, but it's still a very poor country. Still has the challenges that it had before the conflict, but it's not possible to build and to grow. Richard talked about the situation here in the former Yugoslavia, and I know many people have a personal experience in this audience, and I'm speaking as a distant observer. But as he noted, those that were the thugs, those that unleashed violence against their neighbors, against their fellow co-citizens, those leaders were marginalized, many of them taken to The Hague with victims that came forth and testified against them. The ties that those people had with sometimes organized crime and those corrupt organizations that would finance this kind of thuggery were broken, and it was possible with that kind of removal, I think, to restore the rule of law at the national level. And we've had, I still come down here even though we've got all the ICTY fugitives in custody, but working with national prosecutors as they begin to cooperate in these cases, but also cooperate across borders and lines. And I think it's a reflection of what happened at the international level. Another thing, and it's a point that I always make, and it comes to us from Nuremberg, and it's a principle in these courts, and that is that we've had individual criminal responsibility. Basically, the message has been, it's not whole people, it's not whole communities, it's not whole towns, it's not a particular ethnicity or religion that was responsible for these crimes. There were individuals who made the decision to unleash the demons and to use these tools and to incite violence and to bring out the sort of worst angels of men's and women's natures, and it's those individuals that are held responsible in these cases, not whole societies. And as each of these cases proceeds, it takes a weight off the society, and as individual societies then prosecute their own, it's a way in which societies redeem themselves. And someone mentioned the German situation, not perfect, but the fact that Germany went ahead in the 60s and had its Frankfurt trials and has since then been even prosecuting people that were involved as guards in Auschwitz, etc., even following the Nuremberg example, has the effect of redeeming the society, and I think making it possible for people to work together and for countries to work together. And then finally, I think very important, from the point of view, this is all about Europe and changing Europe. I mean, I never go anywhere without saluting the fact that the European Union made a very strong statement and stood solid behind the idea that countries couldn't begin the accession process without full and complete cooperation with international justice. And that's what eventually allowed the ICTY to bring 161 of its 161 cases to trial, a record that's sort of unknown. And even when I was a federal prosecutor in the U.S., I indicted 161 people. I never got them, but it was a reflection of the fact that before you could benefit from the economic integration and the increased trade and development, you really had to cooperate with international justice. And I think that was a powerful message and a very important one. And I wish the ICC had a similar tool when it comes to its fugitives. Now, we can talk about the recent cases, and as an ex-prosecutor, I'm certainly disappointed with some of the results. The court isn't finished. Some of the cases, like the Stanisic case, is still on appeal, and there's a chance for different results. And certainly we've got the Mladic and Karadzic case, a very direct responsibility that are being tried. So I don't think we've finished yet the story of the ICTY, but it's important always to note that these trials are about provable facts and how they connect and how you can connect the perpetrator to the crime. And all of us can have political judgments about who's responsible, but these are processes of legal due process where individuals can be acquitted if there's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt under the applicable standards. I just wanted to say briefly in regard to the ICC that the ICC is obviously a young institution and is just beginning in terms of its trials, but I can see the impact as well. I mean, I've been 10 times to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Profound problems still in the Kivus. I'm so thrilled that we were able to get Bosco Ndaganda and assist the court and bring him to justice, and we want to bring the militia leader from the other side, Sylvestre Mudachimura, to trial, and that could help restore peace in the Kivus. But further north of the Kivus, in Ituri, the ICC has had prosecutions. It's had 3 people brought to trial, and together with some national prosecutions, together with UN peacekeeping forces that disarmed rebels. If you go to Ituri today, it's still poor. There's still challenges in terms of governance and general rule of law. but you will find that the level of violation that was occurring 10 years ago is dramatically down, 90 to 95% less in terms of the violence against women and children and others. And I think it's a reflection of the message that the ICC led in delivering there. And so for those that question international justice, I suggest it's a challenging process. But at the end of the day, when you talk about the worst crimes known to humankind, when you talk about powerful individuals who mobilize society and militias and the most vicious forces, and when you're looking for ways to rein that in and to make it possible for people to live their lives in peace and have an opportunity then to develop and to build prosperity, you need these institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp. I would like to turn last but not least to Ambassador Venewezer, who, besides having incredible experience working with the ICC as President of the Assembly of State Parties, also is, I can say probably, in all modesty, one of New York's experts on responsibility to protect. And I wanted to ask you not only to comment on the subject at hand, but to see if you can already start edging towards the issue of Syria, because I know a lot of people are very concerned about the situation there. There is, of course, no ICC jurisdiction at the moment, but there could be at some point if either the Security Council or maybe the Syrian opposition get their act together. And I think it's important to do that. And after our last panelist has spoken, I also want to open up the floor to the audience. Now, I did observe that yesterday a couple of people thought it would be a great moment to make some statements about themselves or their organization. Let's try not to do that. Let's really try to have questions to the panelists so that we can give everyone a fair chance to participate. First, Ambassador Venewezer, please.
Thank you very much, Louise, and I would like to thank the organizers for having this event. It's a great pleasure to be in a country where both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister mentioned the International Criminal Court in their welcoming remarks at the opening of a session. There should be more states that have this type of commitment at the political level. I'm also grateful for the topic that you have chosen, because it's an angle that is usually a bit neglected. And I think, as we have seen in the discussion, it's not an altogether straightforward discussion. But I do think Mr. Petric is right in saying if you talk about a prosperous economic future, it depends on what notion you have in mind. And if we talk about these things at the UN, we usually call this a sustainable development. And what we mean by that is a holistic view that encompasses environmental dimension, social dimension, not just straightforward sort of crude economic growth. And if you take that notion, that holistic, comprehensive notion of sustainable development, there also is a consensus that the dimension of the rule of law is a key factor in this. In order to have sustainable development, and sustainable is very important here, that means this is long-term, this is durable, this is permanent, and I think in some of the cases that have been mentioned here, that may actually not be the case, and we may see that in the future. But in order to have that, you have to have regulatory frameworks, you have to have rules on land and title issues, you have to have rules on corruption, or rather lack thereof, you have to have good governance, you have to have, very importantly, as Fatou has said, access to justice, you have to have fiscal framework and fiscal discipline. All these things are key, and if you don't have that, you're not going to have sustainable development. If you don't have sustainable development, you don't have long-term economic growth, and you don't have long-term social peace, and perhaps you don't have peace at all. And I think that is the way to frame this in a way, in the large framework of the rule of law. And now, how does international criminal justice fit in? And I think the answer to that is relatively simple in a way. If you have a rule of law environment where the crimes that are the most serious crimes, and everybody agrees, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, the illegal use of force are the most serious crimes under international law. If these are not crimes that are punished, then you do not have a rule of law environment that people believe in. And I think it is very important what Fatou has said, that in all these cases, we see, and she has said it also last night, when she said the people that have the power to commit massive crimes. Because if you are an ordinary person, you can be an evil character, but you simply don't have the means to commit these crimes. So the people who commit these crimes are powerful people. And the people against whom those crimes are committed are very often, or usually, the opposite, are disenfranchised, are poor, and very often do not have access to justice. It's a notion that we are not used to. In our European societies, I'm not used to this, but in many, many parts of the world, there are a lot of people who simply do not have access to the justice system, even where it exists. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second is, and it has been alluded to but not really elaborated on, it's on the cost, so the economic dimension of international criminal justice, because you have all heard how incredibly expensive these tribunals are. And I just want to say here that this is simply a myth. These tribunals are not expensive. You have the ICC that has a budget of now 110 million euro. You know, if you compare it to other costs, be it at the national level, be it in international organizations, that this is not a lot of money. So where does this notion come from, that this is expensive? I think it is really based on a misunderstanding of what these institutions are there to do, because you hear a lot of people that say, oh, well, 110 million euro a year, and we have had one conviction since 2002. So this is how people measure it, and that is completely wrong. Because the ICC is not an institution that is there to put as many people on trial as possible. It is an institution that is there to make sure that there is accountability for the most serious crimes under international law around the globe, or rather in 123 states. So a very important dimension of the work of the ICC is its impact at the national level. And that is something that is still largely or widely misunderstood. Now, not to say that we don't have to ask for savings at the court. I think that is possible. In particular, I believe we have to ask the court to be more expeditious in the judicial proceedings, because I do believe that the length of the proceedings are increasingly becoming a problem, not just economically. It will play a part in the budget discussion, but I think it is becoming a problem as far as the perception of the court, as far as the perception of the right of the defendant. And we all have to work together to that end, and I think it is perfectly feasible. We also have to ask ourselves how we best invest our money if we want to invest in justice. And justice certainly is a worthwhile investment in development and in the future of societies. But if you have a case like the ICTR in Rwanda, where you had, the costs that came up in connection with that tribunal, and at the same time you had a country that had no functioning prison system, and people were imprisoned under the most appalling circumstances and conditions, many of them probably innocent, most of them without charges against them. And this is maybe a case where I think today we would look at this differently and say, well, should we maybe not make an investment in the national system of that country instead of just focusing on setting up an international tribunal? And I think that takes us to what Tina has emphasized, and that is the dimension of complementarity, which simply means that part of what we do under the system that the Rome Statute has established is that we try to strengthen national capacities to deal with these crimes. The idea of the Rome Statute is not to have every perpetrator of a Rome Statute crime in The Hague. The idea is that none of these people go unpunished. And we are all committed as states parties to do this nationally in our courts. And if we cannot do it, for whatever reason, that is when the court comes in. And this is why we have to invest in those countries that are willing to do it, but lack the capacity to do so. And this may be certainly one of the best ways to make an investment in justice. Now finally, and that takes me to what you have asked me to talk about a bit, Luis, I think we have to ask ourselves not only what is the cost of justice, but what is the cost of lack of justice? What is the cost for a country like Syria? And we can talk about this economically, because I think the numbers are going to come out very brutally and very clearly. The costs economically are enormous. The costs, the human costs, are immeasurable, I think, at this point. But I think this is a question we have to ask ourselves. It's been 2.5 years. We have talked about accountability, you know, informally, not in the Security Council. The Security Council has failed really wholesale on Syria. But we have talked about accountability in Syria for quite some time. You know, with my colleagues in New York, I've had these discussions, and the argument was often, oh, this is not a good idea right now because we would like to get rid of Mr. Assad and we would like to offer him an exit, and if we indict him, he's not going to be willing to step down. So what has happened? I think it's a completely false argument. And I think this is very clearly a case, as Richard has said, where you have an opportunity to marginalize a leader who has proven time and again, and proves it on a daily basis, that he does not shy away from using any means available to him to stay in power. The crimes that have been committed, and not only by his regime, also by the opposition forces, are very, very well documented. I do not recall a situation in which we have been sitting at the sidelines watching this for such a long time without doing anything. And you know all the talks about military strikes and so on that are going on right now. I find them very unfortunate. I think they will result in nothing that does any good for the people in Syria, if that is what you're looking at. And the discussion we should be having is really, is this not a moment to talk about creating accountability in Syria by having this sent to the ICC? And it can be done in two ways. It can be done by the Security Council, and as you've mentioned, Luis, it should probably be done at this point by the Syrian opposition itself, which would, you know, have the ICC face some tough legal questions, namely whether, you know, the opposition is the representative really of the Syrian people. But politically, it would send an enormously strong message, and I would like to see those in the Security Council who then still oppose a motion to this effect. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much. Can I then turn immediately to the ICC prosecutor? Let's say this happens. Let's say that you get jurisdiction and it's clear and it's absolutely not debatable. Do you think that the crimes currently being committed in Syria, regardless of who is actually committing them, warrant an ICC prosecution? Are they Rome Statute crimes?
I think so, and I have to be very careful here. As ICC prosecutor not having jurisdiction in Syria and not received any referral from the UN Security Council. But speaking as a prosecutor of international crimes, like war crimes, crimes against humanity, maybe even genocide, I will say definitely that these crimes have been committed. I think there's enough investigations, there's enough domestic identification of these crimes already. We are talking about 2.5 years of this conflict ongoing. We are now counting over 100,000 people dead, and we see recently what has happened with the chemical weapons, and irrespective of which side of the conflict is committing those crimes, I think these are serious crimes that really we need to take a decision. You know, I think we have been prevaricating for a long time. Meanwhile, men continue to die. People continue to die. Children continue to die. And this is what is unacceptable. We have made a promise, the international community had made a promise of never again. But this is where we are today. So I think it's a serious situation that we have to be decisive. It is difficult, I know. It is difficult, but it's difficult issues that have to be confronted. We cannot continue like this. We have a responsibility, as an international community to make sure that we take decisive action in Syria, including considering the issue of accountability for the crimes, particularly.
Thank you. Ambassador Raab, perhaps you can explain a little bit how the thinking is going inside the administration. Is the judicial option being looked at in the same way as the military option? And can you perhaps explain, because I thought it was a little bit cynical that tens of thousands of people die, but one only really starts talking about doing something when chemical weapons are used. I mean, isn't that just encouraging dictators to keep killing people by conventional means, and because that way you know that nobody's going to help out?
Well, no question, horrible crimes. I mean, I was calling it crimes against humanity in May of 2011. And certainly far more serious crimes than were committed in Libya at the time. The United Nations, at the end of February 2011, sent the case unanimously with our support to the ICC. Obviously, there's been a reluctance to become involved militarily on one side, particularly on the side of the opposition, which is what we certainly want to see this Assad regime go, and the question of when and where and how you would do that if you were to do it is a very challenging one, and we'll be debating it in our Congress next week, and I'll be glad to talk about that. I do note that in the past there have been situations like in Bosnia, where it was only in the third or fourth year of international deployment there that force began to be used against the forces that were committing crimes against civilians, when United Nations airstrikes actually took place. And those efforts, together with others, brought the matter finally to peace talks, and also at the same time there were indictments of Mladic and Karadzic. So these things came together, and it took too long, frankly, and we're seeing that to some extent again in a very difficult conflict. In regard to the situation and international justice for Syria, the challenge has been, and I've been to Moscow and talked to their chief legal advisor and others, their response is absolutely no way we're going to vote for a Security Council resolution. We'll veto it. Yet is the answer. So it's not going to the ICC through the method that's there for a non-state party, and you don't yet have an opposition in such control that they could refer the case, or that might occur at some point in the future, and I'm willing to say that might be a route. But we also recognize that if the ICC gets into this situation, it's going to do what international courts do, which is only to prosecute those at the very top, only a relative handful, and there's immense crimes being committed there. And there'll be a great need for justice. And we're not talking about prosecuting everybody, but certainly there's scores of individuals that have been responsible for deaths of hundreds of men, women, and children. So, I mean, what we've been pushing for is efforts to document those crimes. The EU, we have a documentation center that we've set up in Europe with Syrian control of that. The EU is now funding another organization to work in analyzing that material and to build it into cases and to actually looking at each of the mass atrocities and determining who could be indicted and who would be responsible, so that this could lay the foundation from when we have an ICC case for another case. We're also very interested in the alternative of a mixed court like Bosnia, because even with the ICTY, there was a need for a court in Bosnia. And of course, ICTY did 161 cases. The ICC will do, 4, 5, 6 maybe, or something like that. So, and a court like that, as we've heard in the case of Senegal, could be established by a regional organization through agreement with perhaps even the Syrian opposition. So you could begin to set up such a court and begin to look at who kind of international judges and prosecutors that could be appointed. And that then could work very closely with the ICC if the ICC came in. If the ICC didn't, it could be the forum for international justice in that area. And so this is something we're pushing for diplomatically. It won't be easy. It'll cost money. People are very fatigued at that kind of thing. They're fatigued about contributing to the ICC as state parties, I know, in terms of the budget and getting Fatou the resources she needs. But we need justice in Syria, and we've got to find a way to achieve it.
Right. Thank you very much. I want to turn to the audience. Is there anyone who has any questions? Can I start with the gentleman over here? Someone with a microphone will come to you. We don't have a lot of time, so if all questions can be sharp and short.
Thank you. I'm the ambassador of Chile to Slovenia, a resident in Austria. We keep saying that the use of chemical weapons in Syria constitutes a situation of war, crime war, constitutes a crime war. Does it constitute a crime war because chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction? And if this is the case, would the same logic be applicable to all weapons of mass destruction? Thank you.
Right. Oh, this is a very interesting one. Christian, I see you flip your eyebrows. Are all weapons of mass destruction, using them, is that a war crime, I believe, is a question?
Well, you know, there's a history to this, and the use of chemical weapons as such is not contained in Article 8 of the Rome Statute, as you probably know. But there is the use of certain asphyxiating substances is a war crime, and when we have looked at this more recently, because it obviously has come up. I mean, our conclusion was that yes, this would fall under Article 8. But I think the question you're interested in is the other one, I mean, the answer to that is if you use any sort of weapon of mass destruction, you do commit a war crime by the effects that you create, because you indiscriminately kill civilians. So,
thank you very much. Mark, did I see you? Yes, please.
Good morning, Mark Vlasic from Georgetown University, but I used to be a prosecutor at the ICCY, so thank you for all the good work you guys are doing. To follow up on the discussion on Syria, I want to know your comments and thoughts on having a special court created out of the Arab League. I understand the challenges of having a referral to the ICC. Would some sort of regional body be able to provide some sort of judicial support for taking some positive action in this area? Thank you.
Which panelist would be interested in answering that? Richard, please.
Just to start that ball rolling, first and foremost, the use over 2 years of indiscriminate attacks on civilians, failing to distinguish between civilian and military targets, constitutes war crimes that are encompassed under the Rome Statute, and we believe there is a basis for investigation and prosecution. I want to come back in answering your question to Ambassador Rapp's comments. And first, the gravity and scale of the crimes in Syria, and the fact that crimes have been committed by both sides in the conflict, not only the Assad regime, to us underscore the importance, as we've called for now for more than a year, of an ICC referral as the preferable means to deal with these kinds of crimes. At the same time, let's not fool ourselves, and let's not put all the burden on Fatou Bensouda, because as Ambassador Rapp correctly said, while there must be, if not now, then later, an ICC referral, other means, other tools in the justice and accountability toolbox are going to be absolutely necessary, including non-criminal means of reparations, vetting, etc. When it comes to the Arab League modality that you're asking about, I think from the perspective of all means will be needed and not wanting to preclude any particular means, I will say I have real concerns over the kind of justice that an Arab League-sponsored tribunal would bring. Only 2 states, Jordan and Tunisia, are ICC states parties. I would have real concerns about impartial application of the law by such tribunal and the role of the prosecutor. In conclusion, I wouldn't preclude it. I think it would need to be subject to strict scrutiny and also function in conjunction with an ICC referral. We need the whole toolkit and more to help repair the scars.
Thank you very much, Richard. I know there's some more questions from the audience, but we're into our last 6 minutes, so I wanted to give the panelists a chance to reply, and I suggest that we deal with the other things in the coffee break, which is only going to be 15 minutes. But I know Dr. Petric wants to come in at this point.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. You see, as a judge and professor of international law, I think that one should not be so skeptical about a court which would be closer to the region. There are complaints from Africa and serious actions that ICC is too European, Western, and this and that. I'm not going into that. But if a court with responsible members of it would be established in the Arab world with similar standards with ICC, that would first abolish the criticism it is something imposed on us from far away. Second, it would probably make people in the region think more about that. That would make, it would be publicly, in media and so on, much more present. So I think one should not so simply say no. One should think about, and finally, better that than nothing. Better that than nothing. But let me say another sentence. When I listen to the discussion here and watch the Syrian situation, it is such a tremendous and sad repetition of the situation in Bosnia. It took such a long time before international community intervened. I was ambassador to Washington at that time. All kind of discussions, theoretical, practical, and this and that, but people were dying, 200,000. And Syria will be close to that soon. And states which block the action of the Security Council, they have their names. And those names should be set clearly in media and everywhere. Because if we say Security Council should approve the action to save human lives, every day several hundred, maybe several thousand, then Security Council does. The question is, what then? What then? It is the real question. Kofi Annan said years ago, never again Srebrenica and Rwanda. But we have now a new case. Again, it's happening again, in front of our eyes. And we discuss here and there and so on and so on. And international community cannot act. Why? If we would act earlier, a year ago, serious sanctions, which were again blocked in Security Council, things would maybe go the other way. If we would, at the beginning of the Bosnian War, not speculate, is it an ethnic conflict, a civil war, or whatever it is, it was mass murder everywhere around Bosnia. And we would then establish serious sanctions, things would probably go different ways. But what we established, embargo on weapons, for all states of former Yugoslavia. On one side, fully armed, one of the strongest armies of the world, Yugoslav army. On the other side, Bosnians, Muslims, Bosniaks, without any weapons. That's what we did. And I think we should somehow learn something from past events and act now differently as we did in Bosnia. And maybe tomorrow, in 10 years, when we have a similar case, again act differently. I'm sorry. You know, I cannot be quite cool when I know that over 100,000 people have been killed in Syria. And we are, what, watching. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I'm a bit of a quandary because Ambassador Rapp wants to say something, Ambassador Intelman wants to say something, and I want to give the last word to Pillay. So can we all try to do it in a very condensed way to not cut into people's coffee time? Right. Ambassador Rapp.
Yes, and I really appreciate the comments of Professor Petric, which I think spoke for all of us. I think, however, in the context of what we do in Syria, the question then is, what do we do if the Security Council is blocked? How can we move forward with justice? And the idea of working with the Arab League, it's like with the African Union entering into an agreement with Senegal. It's a framework, but we as donors are working with that organization. We've got a committee of direction where we're assisting and helping that process. And I think this would have to be an internationalized effort using that kind of framework, but a hybrid court, not necessarily a regional kind of institution like people have proposed for the AU, something specifically for Syria. But you know, it's a matter that we've got to be creative after 2.5 years and find a solution to begin to bring justice for the victims of these horrendous crimes.
Thank you very much. President Intelman.
Very much. I have to add also a note of pessimism. We all, of course, are for accountability, and we all know that the ICC was created for very difficult situations like Syria. But as we stand now, we must also be aware that a number of states parties to the Rome Statute are extremely wary of another possible Security Council referral of a situation to the ICC, because they just fear that the way that the Security Council is making these referrals is not empowering the court enough to do the job that it is meant to do. And this is also something that is very much in the minds of a number of states parties right now. Thank you.
When I first addressed the Security Council, this is 2 years ago, I reported that 1,000 people had been killed in Syria. They were out on the street asking for the legitimate civil and political and economic and social rights. And at that point, I asked for a referral to the International Criminal Court. That call has been supported by almost 60 countries. The ambassador knows that. Most of these countries are from Europe and Latin America. I have since addressed the Security Council 10 times, and it's not, as much as I liked all the efforts you are doing, Stephen, it's not just the Russians who have said niet. It's your own country as well. So nobody has picked up the call for early intervention, which was my point. When you look at serious human rights violations, find the mechanism, and the United Nations has done this before. The AU has taken initiatives in Sudan, for instance, to have former President Mbeki address the disputed border situation. Now, of course, we in crunch time, where it seems that countries want to intervene militarily, and the Secretary General, obviously, Kofi Annan and Brahimi, are still looking for a political solution. So that's my response. The early warning, and if governments don't pick this up, civil society has to, all of us have to influence our governments to intervene. It's not a violation of sovereignty. It's responding to the calls on the street for protection of human rights violations.
Thank you very much. Before I wrap up, can I just, on a very practical point, say that we're going to have a 15-minute coffee break, and then at 10:15 we will come back here in this hall and we'll talk about the future of EMU, which, of course, if there's no money for any of this justice, then it was all hopeless in the end. I want to thank the panel. I think that the moral calls that were heard, the incredible expertise, the historical knowledge, it was really, I thought, a wonderful way to kick off the day. And I want to thank everyone for coming and the audience for its participation. And please join me in thanking the panel with a big applause.